Man, I am running all kinds of behind today. Um, yeah, somehow it wasn't even that dreary a day, but I just crashed last night and just I was in bed for the first half of the day. I guess that's what happens when you don't have anywhere you need to be and you push yourself as hard as I did very recently. Um, but yeah, so I've been pondering the design of the book that I want to do, the formatting. I do like the discussion of wrongs as the first um, quarter of the well, not really quarter because it's size wise, it's going to be much smaller than everything else. But like the discussion of how to be wrong as the first. Still trying to work some of that. Like I feel like 2 pages per subject for that section would get me 8 pages. So like a 10-page intro section wouldn't be bad. I might be able to bump it up towards like the 14 to 16 pages. Um, because I do feel like I could be really wordy about it, but I also don't want to be too wordy about it and really get into the meat and bones of it. Um, and then like the first real section would be the moral wrongs, and that's about 24 pages with intro and lead in, and then the 20 topics for that category. Um, and I really like where I hit last night, where I was talking about with the moral wrongs. Like a moral wrong or an ethical wrong seems to me to be the right category to use demons as um, the images of them. Um, I feel like I still go back and forth with the biases and the fallacies. I feel like I might swap the place of those two categories. If I'm going to do 100 of each, like the biases by far have the greater number of them. So in the second volume, there are going to be more of those left, like 184, I think I said. 184 biases. And I think there are only like 140 fallacies. And I mean, it seems fitting to have the order of them being, well, that's not true. I was going to say, it makes more sense for me to do like the bigger batch first as like the meat of the chapters, but moral wrongs is only 20 long. So I could do like it really doesn't affect anything in the first volume if I do like the 10 to 16 pages intro chapters, the moral wrongs, and then 100 each of the fallacies and the biases. Um, and in that sense, it makes it easier to go from demons to I don't know. I still go back and forth a little bit because I want to do like a what I'm trying to figure out is like the three categories I can think of are like demons, gremlins or imps, and then general monsters. So in that case, it'd be like a classical mythology demon, and then a little horned tailed problem causer for the next most severe category, which I feel like would be fallacies. Like for a moral wrong, when somebody commits a moral wrong, it's that's criminal. It's you've hurt people, you've done damage, and like murdering your family is a moral wrong. It's not a bias, it's not a fallacy, it's a moral wrong. So that seems fitting to be demons. And so, like, the next most severe category of being wrong, as far as I can see in what I'm building here, would be the fallacy. Because the fallacies are using incorrect thought processes to justify or explain yourself. And biases are just, in many senses, a bias is um, picking information due to a lack of understanding or poorly choosing your choices. Like, you can debias a bias by including more diversity in the processes and finding other perspectives, peer reviewing what you're doing. A fallacy isn't so much a mistake you've made that potentially damages your argument. Fallacy is more of wrong thought or wrong action. Um, a straw man argument is a willful choosing to erect a false point for your opponent in order to tear down that false point and therefore pretend like you've already discredited your opponent. Like, making an argument about you know somebody being for something that they've never expressed an interest in being for, and then refuting that thing that they are not all about, and treating it like you've just proven that this person is not a valid uh, choice between you and them. And we see it in politics all the time. It's a it's a means of gaining an edge by using an argument that sounds convincing unless you recognize the fault within the argument. Now, it's possible to do that accidentally, but it's also possible to do that willfully and with intent. And there is an aspect of some biases that you could bias your data to get you the answer you want. Selection bias is a thing. Um, but it's not usually done with the intent of, it's not really, a bias is rarely an attack, but it can be. Whereas a fallacy is oftentimes, well, no, I mean, fallacy has some of the same aspects. Um, and fallacies don't have to be malicious either. I mean, the sunk cost fallacy is one of those that is sometimes referred to as a bias too. It's the belief that um, something that cost you a set amount to have or to gain, you've put a certain amount of money or time or effort into. And you will continue to pay a maintenance cost to have that thing until you can get the total value that it cost you back. That's not exactly accurate, but basically, if you were to buy, if you were one of those people who bought Beanie Babies when they were a big thing years ago, these silly little beanbag toys, and say like, oh, I almost have a complete set of this set of five, but I need this one. I'll pay $300 for this. And now, what is it, 20 years later, after that whole thing happened, um, you have these things and you find them in your storage unit that you pay $100 a month for 20 years. And you're looking at them and like, well, I'm not going to get them out of storage. I'm going to keep paying to store them um, until I can get $300 for that one. If nobody's going to pay you $300 for it, you'll keep paying $100 a month for a storage unit for storing a bunch of these other things that you'll never get the value. But you're doing it because you've sunk a cost into it and you're determined to get that cost back. And you'll continue to incur costs in the pursuit of getting that original value back. So in the long run, you're actually going to pay more to keep the thing than you would if you just sold it for $30. If you sold it right now for $30 in 2 months, you will have saved the total value of the item in what you wouldn't have to pay for storage. You know what I mean? It's a hard way to explain that. And, that's one of the tricks of working on this right now is, trying to find an illustrative example and defining these terms better than some of the jargony terms they use for these. But yeah, so where was I? Back around. Yeah, I didn't get enough. Like, as much as I overslept, I don't know that I got enough rest. My brain isn't working full speed. But demons for the moral wrongs makes perfect sense. The imps and gremlins for the fallacies, maybe? I could do formal fallacies as imps, which are sort of like lesser demons, and then gremlins for the informal fallacies. And then the biases, which is a larger category, but in my mind at least, a little less severe. I mean, yeah, it's hard to say. Like, a fallacy is a, a mistake of reason, and a bias is a mistake of um, awareness or understanding. And so, like, I feel like the biases being monsters. So going from the 20 demons to the 17 imps and like what was it, 80 gremlins. And then the 100 monsters. And the three different categories of those monsters would be the social, the yeah, the oh, yeah, I lost that. Hang on. So the categories for biases are uh, belief, social, and memory. That's not, no, don't open that. No, don't open. That's not helpful. That's not what I asked you to do. All right, hopefully this is working and I didn't just lose everything. I don't know why it's determined to do it that way. Yeah, it's all right. And yeah, I had a computer crash the other day and lost a bit of data, and trying to get it to reopen without reinstigating that problem is a little difficult. Yeah, I want you to do that. Yeah, I want you to. Yeah. Come on, I'm trying to do this at the same time I'm doing a live stream. Could you maybe do what I ask you to do? Yeah, the crash was just massively disruptive to what I was doing. That was not a good moment for me. Yeah, so the fallacies have the informal, the formal, and the conditional, with subcategories in each of those. And as gremlins go, gremlins and imps are not usually like, I don't know. Yeah, they're not usually seen as quite as diverse as other monsters are. But the biases have belief, social, and memory, and the morals have personal, professional, and global. So I sort of like the three families of each category. The fallacies have more subfamilies. The biases are all pretty much just those three categories. Um, but if I do the bias as monsters, um, the thing about it is, like, with a fallacy, there's not much more to do than how to uh, find them, discover them, be aware of them, and then defeat them. You don't you don't allow a fallacy to exist in an essay, a speech, or a belief system. And, like, if you just permit that fallacy to remain there, it's willful ignorance. You've chosen to be ignorant, and your argument is no longer really considered a whatever your argument may be is no longer really considered a valid um, argument because it has a hole in it that you have chosen to ignore. Whereas a bias is something that sometimes you can't eradicate them all. There's a part of it. I mean, it's a sampling bias is choosing uh, how you choose the people that you get your results from. Like, if you were to do a study and you wanted to study how how um, how good a person is at mathematics when they're intoxicated. If you ran this study at a university, your sample uh, study is going to consist largely of people who have graduated high school and have taken some higher mathematics courses because they're in college or a university or whatever you want to call it. So your sample isn't inclusive of all the potential data. So when your sample, when your study comes out and says that, you know, 67% of people perform higher math functions decently under intoxication, that sample is a sample of university students, not the high school dropout or just the high school graduate who didn't go on to college. And you have no data under which to understand whether or not intoxication affects their ability to perform higher mathematics because they're not in the sample. Your sampling error, your sampling bias has a bias towards college educated individuals. Now, you can eliminate that by running a study on a wider population base. But one of the things we've found in recent aggregates of data is that for a very long time, many studies that have been done on psychological profiles of people in certain, like a lot of psychological studies that have been done, they're now finding that they should probably question the results from them because when they've been done, in many cases, they're done in uh, studies in United States universities. And it turns out that the typical United States uh, result to certain psychological testing is not the same. I mean, we're not, United States people aren't some aberrant, weird psychology, but the data doesn't mean what we think it means because the sampling that was done was Americans. And Americans apparently have a distinctive performance in certain aspects of psychological testing that we have taken for granted as if you do this to a person, happens this way. Turns out that's what happens when you do that to Americans, not necessarily Germans, not necessarily the Japanese, not necessarily people in India or the Middle East. So, I, like, we've been operating under the assumption that this data was indicative of human behavior. And while operating under that assumption, that is operating under a bias. And we've been able to do some things that successfully help people while we worked under that bias, but some people fell through. And finding out that that bias is there means that we don't necessarily throw out everything that we achieved under that bias, but we need to debias a bit and find alternatives that catch some of those people that fell through, either people within the United States who were seen as maybe aberrant because they didn't fit the model, or people from other cultures whose cultural model didn't perform the same way on those tests. Um, so, like, that's that's something I think with the idea of using biases as monsters. There's a way that you know you can you can tolerate a monster in your system if there isn't a clearer, better alternative. If there isn't a clear way to do what you need to do without having a monster in it, then there are ways to tolerate that monster in it. But with a fallacy where this is just wrong reasoning, this is an error in reasoning, and therefore it compromises the argument's ability to be useful. You can be you can make a good argument and use fallacies to make your argument. Well, you can argue for a cause that's a good cause, but make a bad argument because of the fallacies you're using for it. Now, whether or not anybody catches your bad argument, that's not the factor we're dealing with. There are many people who make bad arguments for good causes, and nobody calls them on it because they don't know that that's a bad argument. They're using a fallacy, but nobody calls them on it. Now, that's getting away with it. But if you're trying to make an argument, you do not want to use faulty reasoning. You don't want to say something to the effect of, well, you know, all apples are fruits, oranges are fruits, so oranges are apples too. That's a logical fallacy. That doesn't it doesn't work. But if you can encounter somebody who's ignorant of those things, and you give them an apple and an orange and say these are both apples because apples are fruit, oranges are a fruit, so oranges are a type of apple, they might accept your argument. And in the long run, if you eat an apple or an orange after a meal, for the large part, you're not damaged by believing the false premise that was given to you. So if a fallacy won't always hurt you, and it won't always be called out, and you can miss that they're happening. But it's faulty reasoning, it's false reasoning. A bias is just sometimes a consequence of not knowing enough about how much we know about the topic. It's one of those stupid phrases I really don't want to use, but because it's sort of tainted by an individual who used it in a negative way. But there are things we know there are things we know we know. There are things we know we don't know, and there are things we don't know that we don't know. And a bias is very easily something that falls into a category of things we don't know we don't know. And by that I mean I don't know what knowledge I'm lacking. And a bias has a tendency to come through in those types of situations. I don't know what it's like to be a woman in her 20s in the United States right now. I don't know. And so any choices that I make, if I were in government and I made choices as to things that'll affect the life and quality of women in their 20s in the United States right now, but I make it from the perspective of somebody who's a man above the age of 30, I'm doing that from a place of bias. I'm making those decisions because I think they're going to make the best result for everybody, and they will benefit a part of the population. Now, my choices being made at that point are based off of the bias of my own perspective of life in the United States, and my perspective is biased. Um, so it's sort of like you can inflict a bias, the consequences of a bias on people, and it can go missed. People don't always catch it. Um, but I think the big difference between the two of them is like a bias is not necessarily a fault in reasoning. It's It's my being, in the example I gave, it would be my being unaware of the fact that the way my life works isn't the same as a woman in her 20s. There are aspects of being a woman in her 20s in the United States that I'm unaware of, and I'm not taking them into account when I make my choices that affect both people like me and people like women in their 20s in the United States. That's a bias. That's to me, it's a problem, it's a wrong, and it needs to be resolved. But it's not the same thing as a straw man or some of those other fallacies where you believe a thing that is wrong and like just logically, reasonably, it is wrong. An orange is not a type of apple. That is factually just wrong. You can make a mistake every now and then, and it's that's sort of one of the first chapters, like I mentioned earlier. Making the mistake of calling it an apple, that it happens. You shouldn't beat yourself up. Um, but if you are if it's brought to your attention that you are wrong about that, and the reason you're wrong is you're using this type of fallacy and you ignore it, then it is willful ignorance. And it's a sort of a greater wrong. Choosing to ignore a thing that doesn't fit your model or understanding of the world is a wrong. Um, so, I mean, yeah, that importance of making the distinction between like the minor demons, like the demons of moral wrongs, the imps and gremlins of logical wrongs, logical fallacies, and the monsters of uh, biases feels right to me because the idea of a monster is, uh, like mythology deals a lot with monsters in ways that you can minimize their damage, capture them, trick them, um, put a genie in a bottle. You can't kill the genie, but you can put it in a bottle so that it's not going to affect you as much. Um, there are some cases of monsters that have been tamed in mythology, and like you can look at some monsters as seemingly beneficial, um, like the Pegasus, the winged horse, or a griffin. If you look at some of like I guess Harry Potter references of monsters, not everything that's monstrous is a danger or horrible. Now, being able to accept that some of them are going to exist in the world with us rather than being demons, imps, and gremlins out to cause problems for us. Monsters feels a little bit more like there are wild, dangerous creatures out there, and they can be hurtful if caught in the right if you're caught in the right situation with them. But they're just a part of the landscape, and I think biases, more than the other two categories, are part of the landscape of just the limited nature of being. A bias is something that is a consequence of many biases are a consequence of living in a world where I can't know everything about everybody's situation. And so when I make decisions, I'm doing it from a biased perspective. Now, there are ways to get around those biases by traveling with a party of other people whose uh, skills or abilities weaken the danger of that bias. That's a really hard, vague way of putting that. But so yeah, I like the idea of monsters. And so like the demons for moral wrongs are there are only about 20 of those. And if I do 20 of those, it's easier to do more distinctly stylistic demons. Um, and then like the fallacies being imps and gremlins, or the, I guess it would be the formal, informal, and the conditional fallacies. That that set of three is a little bit easier to do a certain type of creature set of shapes for the images. And I realized like tonight I'm talking almost exclusively about how to stylistically and artistically portray images of these topics. So, yeah, I'm not talking a lot about the writing and the difficulties of them. Although I am talking about how categorization of this works best for my mind. Um, yeah, so anyway, the imps and gremlins, um, I can imagine doing a series of shapes where you use a triangular body or a rectangular body or a circular body. And you can do a oval, triangular, square head. And so like how you mix and match, I don't know if you can see that or not. How you mix those and whether or not you put one eye, two eyes, 8 eyes, glasses, hats, um, an underbite with tusks, or an overbite with fangs, or rat teeth, um, and then long limbs, short limbs, uh, tails or not tails, horns or no horns, long curling horns or tiny little satyr type horns. Um, do they have hoofed feet or ape feet or what? That amount of variety for those, I think, can carry me out all the way through different ones, and then giving them scarves or hats, boots, capes, utensils that they're holding on to, lobster claws instead of hands or something like that. Pitchforks, give maybe some wings. Um, that gives enough variety that I think I could probably get 140 options for logical fallacies or fallacies um, out of the gremlins and imps. Now, making biases, the category that has 180 plus biases, um, monsters means that it gives me the chance to take an image of uh, uh, different sea creatures for some of them, and different bugs, birds, mammals, lizards, mythological creatures, um, make some look like rocks, um, make a few look like blobs or mushrooms or some other strange concoction, that larger category needs more options than necessarily the simple geometric changes structures would offer. So I do think that works better. Um, I may look through. I may have to decide here with the biases has the three categories, and do I do um, plant, animal, fungus, or bacteria? Or do I do plant, animal, mineral? Maybe that may be actually be a good way to go. I kind of like that idea. So do like um, some of the biases might be like boulders, rocks, crystals, metals, gems. Yeah, that's not a bad idea. I might go that way. And then being able to customize them from each of those categories with a variety of, like, if there's 180 uh, biases and you split them roughly into the three categories almost equally, which it's not quite right, but if each category had um, about 60, that's about right, yeah, about 60 monsters in it. It's easier to do 60 variations on like the different families of like the mineral, vegetable, or animal categories, and it opens up a lot of chance. And that's predominantly for the artwork, um, making that work. Now, the thing I'm going over right now in my head about the actual written entries for each of these biases, fallacies, and moral wrongs, I feel like it would be kind of fun to do like the examples, the examples that help uh, define, help you recognize the fallacy. Um, I feel like it could be kind of fun to use like a fictional uncle or fictional relatives who fell prey to these monsters. So it's sort of like um, Uncle Warren was a fruit vendor, and he went to the market to buy his supplies to bring back to his shop, and he was going to buy some fruits, and he'd encountered a fruit he'd never seen before, an orange. And so, when trying to figure out what this new fruit was, he he figured, well, apples are fruits. All apples are fruits, and this is a fruit, so this must be an apple, a new type of apple. That's the example you can give, and it's. I feel like I kind of want to write this book now as like a. There's an aspect of it where I think it'd be kind of fun to tell uncle and aunt stories. Like, oh, my aunt Bernice was uh, she was investing in Beanie Babies, just like family tales, the tales of our encounters with all these monsters and creatures. Um, I think it lends a sort of like it's a little less dry. It's a little less hypothetical. Um, the trick with that is like a lot of these are like that. the uncle went to the market and he had this belief about fruits. He's in that example, he's not encountering the monster. The monster is a byproduct of his own thought process, which is what fallacies are. It's faulty reasoning. Biases are like I mentioned before. A bias is simply not knowing what you don't know and it affecting what you're doing. It's still not a very great example. I have to reword that. But um, they're abstractions. They're not actual encounters. I mean, I suppose I could use them like um, some people use fairies or gene, jinn, um, or other mythical or ghosts. Like some people say, like, you know, this happened in the house not because I didn't plan appropriately to handle like like the power went out because some ghost is causing problems, not because I overloaded the circuit that I just plugged some appliance into 2 hours ago and it just now started to really draw too much. You know, it's like blaming it on a ghost. And that might be a way to go. I feel like as a way of doing the examples of what a thing is, um, I will try to I will try both ways, I guess. I guess I could try just the stories of an uncle who used the fallacy in his own reasoning without portraying it, personifying it in some way. But also maybe writing it as an encounter with a ghost or a spirit or a sprite or a pixie or have them interact with the world that way and cause those things. But the more I do that, the more it's going to start to feel like fiction writing. um, so yeah, I have to think about that a little bit and how to word the explanations of them better. Most of that's really just taking the existing explanations that I've gathered from multiple sources and simplifying the language enough so that it's not specialist scholar language. It's layman's terms. Um, so most of that is pretty straightforward. The how to address like with moral wrongs, how to recognize that you're headed in that direction and how to defeat the moral wrong. That's more of a how do you how do you not become immoral? Um, and that's a little bit more of like how to avoid them, how to like you don't fix murdering your family. You don't resolve that. That is a mess up. So like it's preventative care for the most part. The means of the section on how to deal with moral wrongs is more preventative care, how not to do them. With fallacies, it's more of they can have happened and how to fix them, how to resolve them is um, how to remove them from the arguments or the beliefs that you have and replace them with valid approaches. With biases, it's how to mitigate them or debias where possible, and or sometimes accept the limits of the arguments or beliefs that you have because you can't remove all bias from it. So those are some of the possibilities of that part. And then the categories of each of them. The other thing, I think the thing I'm struggling with also right now is a lot of the names of these different biases. They are cumbersome. They're not easy to remember. Some of them have, like the sunk cost fallacy, is it says what it is, and most of them will say what they are. The problem is that many of them say it in terms that are meaningless to most of the people who would encounter them. Syllogistic fallacies mean nothing to anybody. And I feel like there should be better terms for those. But that's a whole nother workload I have to put in. So I may have to just suck it up and let them be what they are. I mean, maybe I could just treat them as like the complex multi-syllable gobbledygook words that exist there, almost like they're the name. Like Gunther Wolfenbeck. Like that's a heady name. That's a complex gobbledygook of a name for the most part. And using it as sort of a character name, it kind of works. Alrighty, I'm getting a little sleepy here, which I shouldn't be. I overslept, but oh wow, we're at 52 minutes. So I think I'm gonna call it there for tonight. Are we really at day 6? I think we're at day 6. So now that I've really started to get the pegs into this one, hopefully I will finish up the daily updates on this tomorrow with most of the work done, and mainly just the editing and the artwork to be done in subsequent weeks. And I think I can do a weekly update on the progress from that point on for the book. I will probably still do a daily update on whatever next project I'm doing as a daily project update. So that's sort of where I am on that right now. All right, I guess I will see you tomorrow then. I should probably have cut it before now, but I feel like I said some good stuff.